I tried to be patient with a spoiled brat who had everything handed to him. I used to believe that patience was a kind of shield, something you could wear long enough for other people's chaos to exhaust itself before it reached you. I believed that if I kept my head down, worked harder than everyone else, and refused to rise to provocation, things would eventually even out. I was wrong in a way that only experience can teach you, because patience does not protect you from people who are determined to treat the world like it owes them something. I grew up learning how to make myself small in rooms that didn't have space for me. I learned how to read moods before words were spoken and how to anticipate what people wanted so I could stay one step ahead of their disappointment. Nothing was ever handed to me. Nothing was ever assumed. Every opportunity I had came with conditions, expectations, and an unspoken reminder that I was lucky to be there at all. By the time I landed my job at the firm, I had already learned that survival meant competence. It meant being early, staying late, double-checking everything, and never ever assuming that effort would be noticed unless it was undeniable. I was hired as an operations coordinator, a role that lived entirely in the background. I handled scheduling, documentation, logistics, and the endless quiet emergencies that kept the entire place from grinding to a halt. No one clapped for me when systems ran smoothly. No one noticed when deadlines were met effortlessly. They only noticed when something went wrong, and I made sure that nothing ever did. Peyton didn't walk into the office so much as announce himself by existing. He had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no in a way that mattered. His posture suggested ownership, even though he was new. His tone suggested authority, even when he was wrong. He spoke as if the air itself should make room for him, as if the rest of us were background noise in a story centered entirely on his potential. He was hired as a project lead, a title that came with responsibility he had never earned and respect he had never learned how to carry. I noticed the difference immediately because people like Peyton don't have to prove themselves. Their confidence is mistaken for competence, and their certainty mistaken for leadership. He talked about ideas the way someone talks about winning lottery numbers, with excitement but no understanding of the work required to make them real. At first, I told myself it wasn't my problem. I stayed in my lane, I kept the systems running, and I corrected errors quietly. When Peyton missed deadlines, I smoothed things over. When he forgot procedures, I reminded him. When he overpromised to clients, I worked overtime to make it happen. He never thanked me. He never noticed. What he did notice was praise. Praise came easily to him. He collected it like it was inevitable, like applause that arrived whether or not the performance deserved it. When projects succeeded, his name floated to the top. When issues were quietly resolved before they became visible, no one asked how. I watched it happen with a growing sense of disbelief. There was a moment early on when I realized exactly who Peyton was. He missed a critical deadline, one that could have cost us a major client. I caught it hours before it became a problem, and stayed late to fix it, rerouting approvals and restructuring the timeline. The next morning, leadership congratulated Peyton for handling the situation with flexibility under pressure. He nodded, accepted the praise, and didn't look at me once. That was when the frustration started to set in. I started to feel like I was propping up a facade, holding together something fragile while the person benefiting from it treated my effort as an invisible resource. Still, I stayed quiet, because people like me are taught that speaking up is risky, that challenging entitlement makes you look difficult. Peyton's behavior escalated slowly, the way entitlement always does when it goes unchecked. He stopped preparing for meetings, assuming someone else would fill in the gaps. He delegated without understanding and took credit without hesitation. He treated deadlines like suggestions and procedures like inconveniences. And somehow, the more reckless he became, the more leadership leaned into him. I started to realize that his confidence wasn't just tolerated. It was rewarded. The breaking point didn't come from a single dramatic event. It came from accumulation. From the way my name disappeared from documents I created. From the way Peyton started referring to systems I designed as his workflow. From the way my role was quietly expanded without any recognition, while his mistakes were quietly erased. I began keeping records, not out of malice but out of self-preservation. I noted when instructions changed and when expectations were rewritten. I didn't intend to use any of it. I just needed proof that what I was experiencing was real. Because the most frustrating part of dealing with a spoiled brat isn't the behavior itself. It's the gaslighting that comes with it. The way everyone else acts like this is normal, like you should be grateful to support someone so promising. Peyton didn't just rely on my work, he depended on it. And then, without warning, he decided to take it. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. I noticed it when a meeting was scheduled without me. That alone wasn't unusual, but the topic was, it was a systems review, centered on workflows I had built and maintained for over a year. I found out about it accidentally, through a forwarded calendar invite that wasn't meant for me. I didn't panic. I told myself there was an explanation. I reviewed the materials attached to the meeting, and my stomach tightened as I scrolled. The language was familiar. The structure was unmistakable. The diagrams were simplified versions of my own documentation, stripped of context and rebranded with terminology Peyton liked to use. Nowhere was my name mentioned. I sat with that feeling for a long time, the slow realization that something had shifted without my consent. That the work I had quietly guarded was being repackaged and presented as someone else's vision. When the meeting ended, praise followed quickly. Leadership was impressed by the initiative. Peyton was commended for streamlining processes and taking ownership of operational improvements. I was thanked later casually for being supportive. I started to see the pattern clearly after that. Decisions were made without me. My role became reactive instead of strategic. Peyton spoke about operations as if he understood them intimately, while continuing to rely on me to fix the consequences of his shortcuts. The frustration was no longer just emotional. It became logistical. Errors increased and systems were strained. And each time, the expectation was that I would resolve it quietly, preserving the illusion of competence around someone who had never learned how to carry responsibility. I tried to address it professionally. I sent carefully worded emails and for clarifications. Each attempt was met with vague reassurances and non-committal responses. Peyton, on the other hand, grew bolder. He started overriding processes and dismissed concerns as negativity. He treated safeguards like obstacles and reacted with visible irritation when questioned. What made it unbearable was how personal it became. He began referring to my work as basic admin. He implied that systems maintenance didn't require expertise. He suggested that anyone could do what I did, even as he relied on me to prevent collapse. I realized then that this wasn't just entitlement. It was erasure. One day, I was reviewing a project file late one evening when I noticed discrepancies. Dates were altered, approval chains were modified, and documentation was removed. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Then I saw the pattern. Changes were being made retroactively, reshaping timelines to suggest that decisions originated from Peyton, rather than being rooted through me. My contributions were being minimized not through confrontation, but through revision. History was being rewritten. I continued doing my job, but I did it transparently. I documented changes in shared spaces. I clarified ownership in writing. I ensured that processes required explicit approvals rather than informal handoffs. I stopped covering for missed deadlines without noting their origin. The shift was subtle but immediate. Problems surfaced and questions were asked. Peyton reacted poorly. He framed the issues as growing pains. He blamed communication gaps and suggested that my documentation was overly rigid. He implied that my resistance was slowing progress. But this time, there was evidence. Leadership began to notice inconsistencies. Timelines no longer aligned, and claims didn't match records. The polished narrative started to crack under scrutiny. By the time Peyton realized what was happening, it was too late. The structure he relied on to hide his shortcomings had become the very thing exposing them. And for the first time since he arrived, I wasn't invisible anymore. Once visibility entered the equation, everything Peyton had been skating on began to feel unstable. I didn't announce my change in approach. I simply stopped absorbing the damage. Every process had an owner. Every timeline had a record. Every change had a trail. The systems I built were never meant to trap anyone, but they were designed to reflect reality accurately. And reality was no longer flattering to Peyton. What surprised me most was how quickly he noticed. He didn't comment directly, but his behavior shifted. He became more reactive, more controlling, and more present in spaces he had previously ignored. He inserted himself into operational details without understanding them, which only created more friction. Instead of delegating loosely and letting me fix things afterward, he started micromanaging outcomes he couldn't explain. The result was chaos disguised as leadership. Small delays began stacking up. A missed approval here. A misaligned expectation there. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but together they created a pattern that no amount of confidence could smooth over. The more he tried to assert control, the more obvious it became that he didn't understand the machinery he was standing on. Leadership started asking questions. Not accusatory ones, but clarifying ones. Questions that required specifics. Questions that couldn't be answered with enthusiasm alone. Peyton responded the only way he knew how. By redirecting responsibility. Suddenly, I was being copied on emails framed as updates but structured like defenses. Suddenly, my role was referenced more frequently, often vaguely, as if proximity alone could redistribute accountability. Suddenly, decisions he had made unilaterally were described as collaborative efforts, despite the documentation saying otherwise. The most frustrating part wasn't the attempt. It was the assumption. He assumed I would continue to protect him, that I would soften edges and reinterpret expectations, that I would choose stability over truth the way I always had before. But stability built on distortion doesn't last. The extreme moment came during a quarterly review, one of those meetings that determines budgets, staffing, and direction for the next cycle. I wasn't supposed to be central to it. I was there as support, as usual. But the review was heavily focused on operational efficiency, system performance, and process scalability. My domain, Peyton presented confidently. He walked leadership through workflows that bore my fingerprints at every level. He spoke about improvements as if they were spontaneous insights rather than the result of months of quiet refinement. He framed challenges as external pressures rather than internal mismanagement. And then came the specific questions. Management asked questions about implementation timelines and why certain safeguards were removed and others duplicated. Questions that required an understanding of cause and effect. Peyton stumbled. Leadership turned to the documentation. The same shared systems that had once protected him now displayed a clearer picture. Version histories showed who made which changes and when. Dependencies revealed that certain innovations had introduced risks rather than reduced them. I was asked to clarify, and I did. The room shifted. It's difficult to describe the feeling of watching a narrative collapse under its own weight. There was no explosion, no accusation, just a slow reorientation as leadership recalibrated their understanding of where value was actually coming from. Peyton noticed it too. After that meeting, his behavior changed from entitled to threatened. He started scrutinizing my work aggressively, questioning decisions he had never cared about before. He requested revisions without context. He pushed for speed over accuracy. He attempted to assert authority in spaces where competence mattered more than titles. The spoiled brat energy wasn't loud. It was petulant. He resented boundaries, bristled at transparency, and he reacted poorly to any process that didn't center him. And then he made his biggest mistake. He tried to sideline me completely. I found out through an organizational update that my role was being restructured. My responsibilities were being redistributed. My access to certain systems was being limited under the guise of efficiency. The justification was framed as alignment, but the intent was obvious. He wanted control without witnesses. What he didn't realize was that the systems didn't depend on access. They depended on understanding. And understanding couldn't be stripped away with permissions. Losing access should have felt like a defeat. Instead, it felt like confirmation. When you've spent long enough being invisible, You learn to recognize the difference between being undervalued and being targeted. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about eliminating the one variable that consistently contradicted Peyton's narrative. I didn't fight the restructuring. That decision confused people. It confused Peyton most of all. He expected resistance, pushback, maybe even desperation. What he got instead was compliance paired with meticulous documentation. Before the changes went into effect, I prepared transition materials, detailed guides, risk assessments, and dependency maps. I flagged potential failure points and outlined mitigation strategies. I made sure everything was stored in shared spaces, accessible to leadership. Then I stepped back. The systems didn't collapse immediately. That's the thing about fragile structures. They can look stable right up until they aren't. For a few weeks, things seemed functional on the surface. Deliverables went out and meetings continued. Peyton regained his swagger. But underneath, the strain was building. Requests started bouncing, approvals stalled, and minor issues snowballed into delays because no one knew which lever to pull. The operational intuition that I kept things running smoothly wasn't something you could replicate with instructions alone. Leadership noticed the slowdown. Peyton responded with excuses. What he didn't expect was that leadership now had context. They had seen the before and after. They had access to the risk assessments I had prepared. They had evidence that the restructuring had removed expertise rather than redundancy. The frustration turned outward. Suddenly, Peyton was being asked to explain outcomes instead of intentions. Suddenly, accountability wasn't theoretical. The most extreme moment came when a major initiative failed its internal review. Not catastrophically, but definitively. It exposed gaps that should never have existed. An investigation followed where my documentation was pulled. So were system logs, approval histories, and communication records. The story they told was unambiguous. Peyton hadn't just taken credit. He had interfered with systems he didn't understand. He had overridden safeguards for speed and minimized expertise to protect his ego. He reacted emotionally. He attempted to charm his way out of consequences the way he always had. But this time it didn't work. By the time decisions were made, there was no drama left. Just clarity. Peyton was removed from his role quietly. His responsibilities were reassigned. His authority dissolved. And the narrative shifted without ceremony. And then something unexpected happened. I was asked back. Not as support or background, but as leadership. The systems returned to my oversight. The processes were restored with improvements informed by everything that had gone wrong. My role was redefined with explicit authority and visibility. There was no apology or grand acknowledgement. Just correction. And the spoiled brat who once treated the world like it owed him something was finally confronted with something he couldn't take. Override or erase. Reality. Once leadership had made their decisions, the office settled into a new rhythm. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible. But I could feel the difference immediately. Tasks were no longer quietly reassigned without my knowledge. Systems ran according to design, not improvisation. The pressures that had once been constant and invisible now had clear owners, clear expectations, and clear consequences. The air itself seemed lighter. Peyton's absence from operational authority didn't cause chaos, as he had predicted. In fact, it highlighted something everyone had overlooked. Systems need structure and accountability, not swagger and entitlement. Work that had been convoluted or fragile under his hand now operated smoothly again, and the metrics were there to prove it. Deadlines were met consistently, errors dropped to near zero, and processes that had been stressed and stretched were restored to stability. Peyton lingered at the edges. He still came into meetings and still offered opinions. He still tried to assert the same confidence he had relied on before, but it no longer carried weight. Leadership listened politely, but questions always circled back to facts, records, and outcomes. Ambition without accountability no longer had a place. I began to notice a subtle shift in my own perception as well. For years, I had measured my value by how well I could manage, protect, and fix the chaos created by others. Success had been about endurance, patience, and invisibility. Now I realized success could also be about clarity. Competence no longer required sacrifice of visibility. Expertise could exist publicly without contradiction. There was satisfaction in the quiet acknowledgement of reliability. Even if no one ever clapped, there was one final moment, almost anticlimactic, when Peyton attempted to intervene in a system. He didn't understand. I observed silently as his instructions were overridden by automated checks and documented procedures. His frustration was visible, a subtle tension in posture and expression, but it no longer carried influence. The spoiled brat energy was present, but it was harmless now. Like a small storm passing over land that had long since absorbed far worse. I realized then that the most extreme part of dealing with someone like Peyton is not the confrontation or conflict itself. It's the realization that patience and diligence are invisible currencies, that credibility is accumulated quietly, and that sometimes the only way to resolve injustice is not by shouting or fighting, but by creating a system where truth cannot be ignored. And in that system and quiet restoration, I found the satisfaction I had been denied for so long. Weeks turned into months, and the office settled into a rhythm that no longer required me to compensate for someone else's shortcomings. The processes I had painstakingly refined operated efficiently. Teams followed workflows accurately. Deadlines were met with consistency, and unexpected complications were manageable rather than catastrophic. Peyton adapted reluctantly. He shifted roles to areas where his energy was less harmful, where ambition could be contained without destabilizing systems. He still exhibited flashes of entitlement, still expected certain privileges, but they no longer undermined anyone else. His sphere of influence was limited by reality rather than perception. The very tools he had tried to manipulate now acted as safeguards, containing potential disruption, while preserving opportunity for initiative within defined boundaries. I, on the other hand, found myself in a place I had rarely occupied: control. Without compromise. My work was visible. My authority was unquestioned. My contributions were recognized not for their dramatic impact, but for their consistent reliability. I was no longer invisible. I had never sought recognition as an end in itself, but its quiet presence reinforced something essential. The value of competence, diligence, and persistence cannot be erased, even by charm or entitlement. In the end, there was no need for confrontation, no need for vindictive action, and no need for dramatics. The satisfaction lay in continuity, in systems restored, in truth made unavoidable. The spoiled brat had been contained. The work I had built endured. And for the first time, the recognition that mattered was mine. I had survived the chaos. I had endured the entitlement. And I had emerged not by fighting against someone else's narrative, but by allowing the structure I maintained to speak for itself. And finally, I was done with being invisible.